History is written by the victors. It is carved in stone monuments, painted in oil portraits of generals, and recorded in the strategic maps of empires. But history has a blind spot. It forgets the silence that follows the scream. It forgets the thousands of souls who survived the hell of the trenches, only to face a different kind of abyss when the guns finally fell silent. April 1945. The world exhaled. But for thousands of highly trained war dogs, the end of combat wasn't a liberation. It was a death sentence. These were not pets. They were German Shepherds, Dobermans, and Airedales, bred and broken for violence. They had sniffed out mines, carried messages through sniper fire, and guarded the sleep of men who would never sleep peacefully again. They were deemed too aggressive, too damaged, too dangerous for civilian life. The order was clear: decommission, or worse. At the same time, in the sterile, white-walled halls of early post-war hospitals, a different crisis was unfolding. The soldiers had returned, but their minds had stayed in the mud. They called it shell shock. We now know it as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but in those days it was a stigma, a weakness, a silence that screamed louder than any bomb. Traditional medicine had no answers. Psychiatry was in its infancy, often cruel, always distant. The veterans were isolated, trapped behind walls of invisible trauma, unable to connect with a world that didn't understand their pain. Two groups of survivors, both discarded, both haunted by the same ghosts. The soldiers, broken by what they had seen. The dogs, broken by what they had been forced to do. They were mirrors of each other's trauma. Hyper-vigilant, anxious, alone. But in the shadows of these institutional failures, a radical idea began to take root. A handful of visionary, perhaps desperate, physicians looked at the disposable animals and saw something the military bureaucracy missed. They didn't see weapons, they saw witnesses. They saw creatures who understood the language of fear because they spoke it fluently. This is the untold story of how the blood-stained paws of discarded hounds built the foundation of modern mental health recovery. This is the story of how the bond forged in violence became the blueprint for healing. Before there were therapy dogs, before there was even a name for what they did, there were just broken men, and the dogs who refused to let them drown in the silence. To understand the miracle, we must first understand the cost of silence, and the grim reality of what happens when the war ends. But the battle for the soul has just begun. The decision was not just controversial. It was considered insane. In the mid-1940s, military medical protocol was rigid. Order was sanity. Chaos was disease. To introduce unbreakable, canine veterans, animals known for their aggression, their trauma, their very wildness, into clinical recovery spaces was a violation of every rule in the book. Critics called it a security risk. They said these dogs were ticking time bombs, relics of a violence we were trying to forget. You cannot heal a mind with a beast, one chief of psychiatry reportedly argued. But Dr. Arden and his small team of rebels saw something else. They saw that the sterility of the hospital was part of the problem. The veterans weren't healing because they were being treated like broken machines, not broken humans. The first week was a disaster. The wards descended into chaos. The dogs, themselves suffering from what we now recognize as canine PTSD, were hyper-vigilant. They paced. They barked at shadows. They mirrored the anxiety of the men they were meant to help. It was a clash of two traumatized worlds. The rigid military structure crumbled under the weight of raw, unfiltered emotion. But then, it happened. The moment that would mark the unofficial birth of modern animal-assisted intervention. Thomas hadn't spoken in 6 months. He hadn't touched another living soul since the Battle of the Bulge. But this dog, this discarded weapon, didn't ask for words. It didn't demand eye contact. It didn't judge his silence. It simply offered its presence, a warm, living anchor in a sea of cold memory. It wasn't magic. It was biology. It was psychology. It was the power of oxytocin, the bonding hormone flooding brains that had been starved of connection for years. The dogs acted as social bridges. They allowed these men to express affection without the fear of judgment, to be vulnerable without the shame of weakness. The doctors watched in stunned silence. The unpredictable, Beasts were doing what years of therapy had failed to do. They were breaking through the wall. They were proving that the bond forged in blood and mud could indeed cure the wounds inflicted by that same violence. But why did it work? Why did these specific animals, these veterans of the trenches, succeed where others might have failed? The answer lay in a phenomenon we now call mirroring the trauma. Why did these specific animals succeed where others failed? It wasn't just training. It was resonance. Psychologists later identified a phenomenon they called mirroring the trauma. Both the soldiers and the war dogs returned from the front lines with the same invisible scars: hypervigilance, startle responses, and a deep, gnawing anxiety. They were speaking the same silent language. For a veteran suffering from severe PTSD, human interaction was often triggering. A touch could feel like an attack. A loud voice could signal danger. But a dog? A dog understood the need for space. A dog understood the value of silence. When a soldier saw his own fear reflected in the dog's eyes, he didn't see weakness, he saw survival. And in that recognition, the shame began to dissolve. The dogs acted as social bridges. In a world that demanded men be stoic, unbreakable pillars of strength, the dogs offered a safe harbor for vulnerability. You can cry in front of a dog, and it won't judge you. It won't tell you to snap out of it. It will simply lean against you, grounding you in the present moment. This was the birth of non-judgmental companionship as a clinical tool. Biologically, something profound was happening. The presence of these calm, bonded animals triggered the release of oxytocin and dopamine in the veterans' brains, lowering cortisol levels, the stress hormone. It was a natural antidote to the poison of war. The dogs weren't just comforting. They were physically recalibrating the nervous systems of men who had been stuck in fight or flight for years. This shift in perspective was revolutionary. We stopped seeing these animals as tactical weapons, tools to be used and discarded, and began recognizing them as sentient partners in recovery. They were not subordinate, they were equal, they were co-therapists. The hierarchy of the military, so rigid and vertical, was replaced by a horizontal bond of mutual respect. One doctor wrote in his journal, "The animal does not heal the wound. It heals the isolation around the wound." And that isolation was the true killer. By breaking it, these discarded hounds didn't just save individual men. They changed the very fabric of how we understand mental health. But the story doesn't end in the 1940s. The legacy of those experimental wards ripples forward, evolving into the sophisticated, science-backed programs we see today. From those muddy, chaotic beginnings, we have built a global movement. But how far have we really come? And what new tools are we using to honor that original, blood-stained bond? Today, in 2026, the legacy of those experimental wards has evolved into a sophisticated global science. The discarded hounds of the past are now honored as pioneers. Modern service animals are no longer just companions. They are integrated partners in mental health care, supported by technology that would have seemed like magic to the doctors of the 1940s. We now use AI-enhanced biometric monitoring to track the physiological state of both the handler and the dog. These smart systems can predict a PTSD episode before it happens, alerting the dog to perform specific grounding tasks. It's a symbiotic loop of data and empathy. But despite the algorithms and the sensors, the core mechanism remains unchanged. It is still about presence. It is still about the silent promise: you are not alone. The bond forged in blood and mud has evolved into a global movement for mental health awareness. We no longer whisper about shell shock. We speak openly about trauma, resilience, and healing. And at the center of this conversation are the animals who taught us how to listen to the silence. They showed us that healing isn't about erasing the past, but about finding a companion to walk through it with you. Yet, we must ask ourselves, have we truly paid the debt? For every service dog today, there were hundreds in the past who were deemed expendable. They gave their loyalty, their sanity, and often their lives, not for glory, but for the men and women who held their leashes. They were the first therapists, the first healers, the first to show us that even in the darkest trenches, connection is possible. So, the next time you see a service dog in a vest, remember where it started. Remember the muddy paws. Remember the discarded soldiers who refused to give up on us. They didn't just survive the war, they built the world's first healing centers. And in doing so, they saved not just our bodies, but our souls. This is their story, and it is ours.